these chairs regal enough for you, you Republican?
These are very unlikely.
You are king-like.
Thank you. I thought I was queen-like, but anyway.
And judging by the duration of our introductions, I think everyone's here to see me. So let's just establish that.
Thank you for filling in for Mark.
Off the bat. The books that you've written, I was just scrolling through them before. So in terms of books about people, Ned Kelly, Mawson, Kingsford Smith, Monash, Burke and Wills, Cook, I'm missing.
Nick Farr-Jones, John Eales.
Yeah,
Les
well,
Darcy,
of course, I'm not even going
Nancy
into
Wake,
sports.
Nene King.
See. Gallipoli, Kokoda, Vils Bretner, The Bounty. You haven't written a book about a building yet. Why this one?
Well, because I read an article in the Paris Review, and I tossed that off lightly as if I'm always reading the Paris Review.
Every time I see
reading I think I've read one article in the Paris Review in my life. But I was reading in the Paris Review, I think it was on Montparnasse, an article about American writer David McCulloch, and he'd written a famous book, an iconic book in America, on the Brooklyn Bridge. And it was his idea 50 years ago. Where did this bridge come from? What are the stories involved? And that planted the seed, and I had quite a lot of researchers at the time, and I put one researcher for about 2 months. Said, go into the archives, see what you can find that's not been previously brought to light. And we had breakfast with another researcher, so the two of us sort of were leaning forward, well, what did you find? And the story started to come out. And so the idea was, I wanted to call the book, we're all in Roselle, we can all use grown-up words, one rude word and I'll stop. I wanted to call the book The Opera House, where the fuck did that thing come from anyway? Because you look at that exquisite pearl, architectural pearl on the shores of Sydney Harbour, and realise that it was conceived and signed off on in 1950s Australia, which, with the greatest respect, was probably the dullest place on earth. It was surrounded by a white picket fence. People ate meat and 3 veg every day, went to church on Sundays, and that was their life. And somehow or other, 16 men of the New South Wales Cabinet looked at a scale model around the cabinet table of this thing that there'd never been anything like it before, anything like it since, and they looked and went, yeah, we'll build that bastard. How did this happen? And of course, Ewan Utzon is the one that deserves most credit for conceiving it, but there were so many other obstacles to overcome, the principal one of which, and I don't think he's got the credit he deserves, Joe Carl. And now Joe Carl's forgotten in this town, only for the Carl Expressway. But Joe Carl was a really hard scrabble, Arthur Caldwell type Labor, or in it for the people, and his idea of a good time on a Saturday night was a sausage sandwich at the Wenny Park Dogs. And he had never been to the ballet, he'd never been to opera, anything like that. And he said he was approached by Eugene Goosen, the European conductor who'd come to conduct the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. The town hall, Sydney Town Hall, sounds like a barn, we need an opera house. Carl took it on board, said yes, let's get ourselves an opera house, was immediately attacked. Why are you building this thing for the elites, for women with mink coats and men in bow ties? And he said, because my opera house, the opera house that we build, will not be for women in mink coats and men in bow ties. It'll be for waitresses and carpenters and unemployed. It'll be for the workers. So that was the original concept.
And you mentioned Utzon. I think we should talk about him Let's kick things off with that. But did you have preconceptions about him and his life before you started researching the book, and were they challenged or confirmed?
None at all. But tell me this, as an ABC man, when you go into the ABC and you see how many people in the ABC would know who he is, what his background.
Oh, I think everyone would know his name and what he did. How many people would, and probably his nationality.
So I'll tell the story. In 1947, he was flown, famous European conductor. Sydney Symphony Orchestra was a big deal. There's an apocryphal story, too good not to repeat, that after the first rehearsal, the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, Eugene Goosen leans forward and says, stop, and leans forward and says, let us start at the beginning. This is a violin. And he was underwhelmed, but he was the most sophisticated European, we were Sydney-siders, and this guy's European and he speaks French. You know, how good is that? And he's a conductor. And unbeknownst to anybody, he had a few sexual peccadillos. And one night, and he was in Glebe Point Road in a bookstore, and he's doing what you do, and he's looking at the Dickens, and he's looking at Proust, and there's some art displays, and there's a particular book, an art book, with bare breasts and horns, and it's speaking his language. And so he buys the book, he takes it home, and who's it by? It's by a Sydney artist who was known as the Witch of King's Cross, Roy Norton, who was a famous Sydney figure. And she was a Sydney witch, and she came from, admittedly, the unlikely suburb of Linfield.
When you say a Sydney witch,
she was a devil worshipper.
She was an occultist.
She was a devil worshipper that came from Linfield. I mean, they're weird, those people from Linfield. They look straight down the line, but you lift back the covers and there come out the horns. There they are. And so he makes contact with her, and he enters this world of incense, bit of devil worship, bit of few sexual maybe a few whips.
A bit of devil
Who
worship.
Who knows? But it was weird, you know, well, like at the time, it was odd. And
right.
So he gets involved with this witches' coven, and the recording studios for the ABC are not far away, so at lunchtime he'd go down. Anyway, the sad thing is, he goes back to England on a trip. He buys, he buys 1,000 dirty pictures, essentially. And it's a really sad story. Comes back through Sydney Customs, he's arrested. What have you got in the bag? They open it up and out comes, you know, sexual stuff and these photos. And he was torn apart in the tabloids, and that was the end of him. But he deserved, and things that on the internet today, I'm told, would not raise a single eyebrow.
And 1,000 pictures in those days, you can't put them on a thumb drive, can you?
No, they were in folders that were taped up, and so they pursued him on obscenity charges, and there was a particular policeman who wouldn't let go, and they took it up and up and up. He was destroyed in the tabloids, but a policeman smuggled the file out in the hubcap of his FJ Holden, put it up in his top cupboard, and David Salter, the great ABC man, who used to be the producer of Media Watch, he went to visit him in 1998. He said, "Have you got anything about it?" He said, "You mean this?" and handed him the folder, and all of the stuff came out. But Eugene Goosen was the one that deserves credit for getting behind the Opera House, convincing Joe Carl. And then the other one, the story that I love, how are we going to do this? How are we going to build an opera house? What's the design? We need an international competition. So they launched this international competition. We'll get 4 judges, and there were 232 submissions, and this is my favourite story of the lot. The 3 of the judges gather at the New South Wales Art Gallery with these 232 submissions. The 4th judge is a man by the name of Iro Saarinen, who is a Finnish-American architect, and he swans in 3 days late and says, "Well, you know, what have you winnowed it down to?" And they said, "Well, we've got these 10 finalists." So he starts to look and he says, "Well, it's none of those. Well, where are the others?" Well, there's a pile, yay high, 3 feet high, 222 other submissions, and he starts, and 3 hours in, he gets to submission 218, and he pulls it out, takes one look, and he says, there, gentlemen, is your Sydney Opera House. And they look at it and say, "Well, you know, they've never seen anything like it." And 2 days later, he gets them down. I want you to meet me at Bennelong Point. Why? Meet me at Bennelong Point. They go down to Bennelong Point. There's a rowboat. Get in the rowboat. Get in the rowboat. Gets in the rowboat. Pulls out, and goes out 200 metres off the shore, swivels it around, get in the back. Get in the back of the boat. Swivels it around, and he brings out a drawing of the Sydney Opera House, and they lean forward, and ding, 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 the lights come on. Of this is what it could look like. And again, one of the themes of the book I mentioned of how stunning this achievement was. Again, the older Sydney-siders here will remember how swish we in Sydney felt we were in the 1970s to have the Hilton Hotel. Remember the Hilton? This was no, travel lodge. This was the Hilton Hotel, and you could go to the theatre. You're too young to remember, but it was a big deal. You could go to the theatre in Sydney, and I'm talking a Tuesday night. You could go to the Hilton Hotel at 11 o'clock at night, up the escalators, turn left, and you could have apple strudel and cappuccino. We were that sophisticated. And then in 1982, they opened the Regent Hotel. Remember that? Down the bottom. And that was swish. That was seriously swish. And look at that building, and look at the design, and look how wonderful the Regent. Everybody forgot about the Hilton. It was all about the Regent Hotel. Here we are, 44 years later. Look at the Opera House, opened in 1973. Look at the Regent Hotel. The Regent Hotel, with the greatest respect, looks like a wet Wednesday afternoon in June. It's dowdy, it's just dull. And you look at the Sydney Opera House 10 years earlier, it looks as sparkling and as pristine as a Sunday morning in the year 2525. It never gets older. It's absolutely stunning. And yet, when they started, so they call up Utzon and say, "You've won." And Utzon was thrilled, even though he'd won other international competitions 7 times before. And they said, "Not only have you won, but we want you to build it." He said, "You what?" The other seven times he'd won, they'd never gone on to build it. They said, "You won, we want you to build it." So for the first 5 years, the first problem was, how do you build it? You know, he'd done this stunning diagram of what the Opera House looked like. And it's going too far. Robert Hughes, the late great Robert Hughes, went too far in saying that it was a wonderful line. He said it was really nothing more than a magnificent doodle. You know, but it wasn't. There was no detail to it. And so when the engineers said to Utzon, "What's the shape of the sails?" He said, he got a plastic ruler, he bent it, and he said, "That shape." Well, the engineer said, "Well, it can't be that shape. You know, how do we build it so it can withstand, if necessary, 150 mile an hour winds? How can we build it so it'll stand for 500 years? Is it 3 inches thick, the sails? Is it 6 feet thick? Is it a parabola? Is it an ellipsis? Is it, maybe not ellipsis, dot, 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 isn't it? No, probably not an ellipsis." But it took a long time. But again, a story that I love out of it is that in the early 1960s, they said, "You're going to have to leave Copenhagen and move here with the family." And so he gets the family in where California is the place they ought to be. So they loaded up the truck and they moved to Beverly, gets them in the plane, gets the Utzon family, puts them, they fly to America, they get on a plane to come across the Pacific Ocean. And they're 2 hours out of Sydney, and Utzon, the New South Wales government, is flying them economy, as you do. You probably never heard of economy. It's where,
what's that?
And he notices, 2 hours out of Sydney, he notices that the flight attendant, hostesses as they then were, is handing out socks because it's very cold. And Utzon, a very softly spoken gentleman, says, "Excuse me, yes, could I have some socks for myself and my family for we were very cold?" And the flight attendant says, No, you can't. Well, that's for first class passengers. And an hour later, she comes back and says, "Excuse me, are you Mr. Utzon from Copenhagen? Are you the architect?" "Yes." She says, "Oh, we've just got radio. Sydney has just radioed with a message. The Queen of England is in the Royal Yacht Britannia, moored at Circular Quay, and she'd like to know if you would like to join her for lunch." And Utzon said, yes, thank you, that would be very nice." And the flight attendant said, "And would you like some socks?"
So the legend of Utzon then becomes one of the trials and tribulations and disappointments and infighting about the eventual unfolding of the construction of the Opera House. What happens with all that? I worked with 2 researchers who were totally opposed to each other. The question is, nobody doubts Utzon's a genius. I mean, it's an absolute genius and a fine man, a really wonderful human being, and a Republican. But don't get me started, actually a Republican, despite being Danish, but expressed amazement that Australia had a monarchical system. I was thrilled to find that. But my 2 researchers were opposed to each other about whether he was responsible, whether he should have been let go, or whether he was
Rembrandt that had been pushed out early. And the truth is somewhere between the two, because the truth of it is the same brain that could conceive something of that level of genius was not necessarily a managerial brain. And the ability, so when he resigned in February of 1966, he had about a dozen draftspeople. And the complexity of the Opera House, I mean, I would have thought before beginning this book that there were, how many rooms do you think in the Opera House? I'd say, I would have thought 27, but when I think about it, no, probably 54. Look, let's call it, maybe 70. A few toilets, a few acoustic rooms, whatever. Let's go 7. There's over 1,000 rooms in the Opera House. I haven't got the figure before me, but it's stunning. And each room has to be wired for electricity, for ventilators, for acoustics, the ones where there's performance space. The complexity is stunning. So when he resigns in February of 66, there are a dozen draftspeople. 3 guys take over as architects. They work for the next 7 years and they have 118 draftspeople. And so that was the complexity. But Utzon throughout those 60s would not be rushed. He would not be pushed. He realised this was his life's work and he wanted to sign off on every detail. So when he left, the 3 guys that came in, one of them was David Littlemore, who was the father of Stuart Littlemore, another man by the name of Lionel Todd, but the principal was a man by the name of Peter Hall, and he was a brilliant architect in Sydney. He went to the college I went to at Sydney University, Wesley College, and they approached him, and when Utzon was sacked, or when Utzon resigned, Hall was signing petitions, bring back Utzon. He was going to bring back Utzon rallies. Then they said, we want you to do it. And he said, well, I don't want to do it. And they said, listen, if you don't do it, think your way through this. This guy has gone. Do you want us to have empty shells on Sydney Harbour? We've got to finish it. Somebody's got to do it. And Hall did it. But it broke him. And he had 4 children. I talked to all 4 children in the course of the book. And the youngest, her name's Antigone, must be a young woman in her early 40s now, and she came to visit to have a cup of tea so I could interview her, and she'd just been walking that morning at Kirribilli Point, and I said, that must be really something for you to, to have something like that, to gaze across the waters of Sydney Harbour, see the Sydney Opera House and go, well, that was my dad. My dad gave his life to that, devoted his life, 7 years of his life, to building this masterpiece. And she said, no, I look across I see it and I'm filled with sadness because I see my father's destroyed life. And it did. It absolutely broke him. And so those are the stories that I wanted to bring out.
Peter, you just toggled a few times between Utzon resigned or Utzon got fired, and you kept catching yourself and going, resigned, fired.
He resigned.
What would it have taken for him to stay on?
Well, his inspiration was a Swedish architect who came up with a design in the early I think it was 1915, but a Swedish architect just across the waters from where he was living in Denmark. I think it was the Stockholm Town Hall, and this guy was a revolution in architecture who said, we don't have to, just because we built in a certain way in Sweden for the last 400 years, we don't have to keep building that way. This building that he designed, this is going to change Stockholm, it's going to change Sweden, it's going to have light, it's going to have new materials, it's going to have new techniques, and he built it, and Sweden changed. And that was Utzon's inspiration, and this guy was famous for when he didn't get his way, he said, I resign. And they said, please don't go. So Utzon was threatening to resign. Davis Hughes comes in, Sir Davis Hughes came in, Minister for Public Works in the Askin government, and was hammering Utzon, when basically like the Pope with Michelangelo, when will you make an end? You've got to stop blowing out the budget, you've got to give us the designs we need, the engineers can't be treading water. And Utzon went, I resign, thinking that Davis Hughes would go, please don't. Instead, Davis Hughes goes, taxi! Take this man to the airport. And Utzon was never to be seen in Sydney again. And so then, again, had he not resigned, how long would it have taken? What was the budget? I don't know. And I was asked last night why Utzon never came back to Sydney. And I think it's because when everybody here looks at the Opera House, we see what we see. We see a masterpiece, this extraordinary building. Utzon, I suspect, would have seen, but what it could have been, what it could have been. And he
And how far is it from that? Like, how far did it diverge from what his original vision had been? Do we know?
Well, if you ask the three architects, that when they took over, they were told it'll be 18 months. They would say, you'll knock this over in 18 months, we've got the plans. When they paid Utzon the money for the plans, and there's this stunning moment where the money's been paid, where are the plans, and they go in and they're expecting, 3,000 plans for this, for that, for the other. There were 118 plans. That was it. And so that was where the 7 years disappeared. So in terms of what it would have been, this is the amazing thing, that when he won the competition for the Opera House, they didn't know how to build it. They didn't know if it could stand. And so a lot of this stuff was, not making it up as they go along, but Utzon said, I like to work at the edge of the possible. And for a lot of the engineers, he'd gone the other side. He was on the edge of he'd gone into the impossible. For a long time, it appeared like those sails never would stand. And it was Utzon himself who came up with the solution of the shape. The original conception of the shape of the Opera House was Utzon was like Frank Lloyd Wright. And again, I'm tossing off that name like I intuitively understand all about it.
While you were reading the Paris Review.
That's exactly right.
At Frank Lloyd Wright's
and as I understand the essence of Frank Lloyd Wright architecture, it is that you don't just plonk down buildings willy-nilly. You look at the landscape, you look at the context, you want to make them as if they are organically grown there. Now, a classic example of when things are not organically grown, when you go to the Northern Hemisphere and you go to England, for example, all the windows are on the southern side of the buildings. Why? To capture the light. And in Australia, we like northern-facing buildings with the windows to capture the light. When they built St Paul's College in 1882 at Sydney University, where it was an English architect, he put all the windows on the southern side. That's why Paul's College is freezing, because the sun is hitting rock. It's not hitting the window, it's not coming into the light. So when Utzon, who was a devotee of Frank Lloyd Wright and had studied under him in America, when he first hears the competition, he goes to a marine chart shop in Copenhagen, show me the headlands of Sydney Harbour, what naturally grows there. And what he found, what particularly interested him, was the shape at Watson's Bay, where Doyle's fish shop is, and you go up to the gap. The shape there, this is what grows, this sort of curving going up to the top, and you wanted to go up, and then you look over the gap. That's what he saw. And we can see in the sails of the Sydney Opera House, you can see the shape of those headlands. That's what grows. And yet there is also a very strong Indigenous angle with the Opera House, because it was where the middens, they had the Indigenous, the Gadigal people, that was where all the shells and the middens were there. And when they captured Bennelong and they taught him English, and Bennelong became friends with Governor Phillip, and then they built a cottage for Bennelong on Bennelong Point, which is why they named it Bennelong Point. And Bennelong then invited Phillip with the senior officers to come down for a performance. And so they come down, they don't know what they're about to witness, and then the Indigenous people did a corroboree for them. And in the tragic black-white history of Australia, which is just shocking, here was one shining moment. And the shining moment was the white fellas looking at the Indigenous people doing corroboree, seeing this is really sophisticated. This is the same, they're all doing the same movements at the same time. They're chanting the same thing. This has been rehearsed. And so it was a step upwards of understanding that this was a culture totally different to theirs, but it was a seriously sophisticated culture.
So you mentioned that the idea was that this would not be for women in mink coats. This would be an opera house for the people. This would be for workers and for everybody. And the first performance at the Opera House was actually for the construction workers.
Yes,
is that right? And tell us who
I love that story. Paul Robeson, the great black American singer and great activist, and very strong on civil rights, was visiting Sydney and visiting Australia, and he said, I'd like to sing for the workers. So he goes down, and if you Google tonight, old man Paul Robeson, Sydney Opera House, there's 3.5 minutes of Robeson singing to the construction workers. But there was one interloper, and he was not a construction worker, but he slipped through the gates. He was a 16-year-old office worker from Bankstown. On his lunch break, his name was Paul Keating. And there he was. And so again, the genius of Joe Carl in getting this, financing it, he knew he couldn't take it out of general revenue because people would say, quite legitimately, this is coming from hospitals, this is coming from the roads. So he knew that if he'd said to the people of New South Wales, we're going to build an opera house, we're going to have theatre, we're going to have opera, we're going to have ballet, they'd say, we'll get nicked. But he said, I'll tell you what, we'll do a lot of gambling. We'll get an opera house lottery, and instead of winning £10,000, you can win £100,000, everybody all in. And so it started to raise the money that was necessary to do it. But we in Sydney were so innocent of the dangers of the world that in those days they had the first winner. Here is the Johnson's family from Yarrabung Road, St Ives, and they've won £100,000. What about that? There they are, 64 Yarrabung Road, you beauty. And there they are, and here are them with their lovely children. And there they go, details of the family, how much they won, where they live. The 8th winners were the Thorne family from number 8 Edward Street, Bondi. And there they are, and there's 8-year-old Graham Thorne. And they send him off to school 3 days later, never to be seen again. The kidnapper calls and says, I've got your son, give me £25,000 or I'll kill him. And unbeknownst to them, he did kill him by mistake. He suffocated him and maybe chloroform in the back of the car. And it was one of the great forensic detective stories, one of the first forensic stories in that had happened in Australia, because when they found the body, I think it was Grandview Parade Seaforth, these 3 little boys, one of whom's now 85 years old, came to my launch. These 3 little boys playing near a cave, they see there's a blanket and then they can see a head and they race to their parents. There's a body out there. They call the police, and that blanket, they take the blanket to Sydney University, they put it under the microscope, and they work out it had a particular type of grass on it. It had pink mortar. It had the leaves of 2 particular cypress trees. So this particular policeman goes to Balgowlah Post Office, and he says, I want to see all your posties. And he says, and this was the closest post office to where the body was found. He says, guys, we would have said blokes, he said, I'm looking for a house that's going to have grass like this out the front, it's going to have cypress trees, and it's going to have pink mortar. And he looks around, nothing. A month later, most of the others have moved on. This guy's still going, still following up leads, and he's visiting one of his leads, and the postie at that moment turns up and says, did my mate Jacko get a hold of you? No? Why? Oh, Jacko knows the house you're looking for. And it was the house. He turns up, there are the 2 cypress trees, there's the grass, there's the pink mortar. Where's the owner? He's on a ship bound for Sri Lanka, Ceylon, and they arrested him at Ceylon. And, so those are the stories that came out.
It's unbelievable. I mean, imagine winning the lottery and then losing the worst lottery that you could possibly lose.
Because the Americans had the Lindbergh kidnapping. Yeah. I think that was in 1932. And we had one other case in Australia of a kidnapping where, there was a ransom in the 1930s. I think it was a grazier. But we'd never been exposed to that kind of stuff. And it was a bit like Ivan Milat. And one of the third book I did was called Hitchhiking for Ugly People. And I had, in the 1980s, I just used to hitchhike everywhere because it was fascinating. I loved it. And because I had no money. But then Ivan Milat came, and that was the end of it. And with this Graham Thorne murder, that was the loss of Australian innocence, where for the first time people thought, will my child be safe?
Mm. Are those street names actually correct? Have you memorised the street names and numbers of these families? When you talk about the families?
Not the first one, but the last one, yes. Because there's a Mark Tedeschi, who's the former Crown Prosecutor, who... I don't know if he's here tonight, I should have told him, but he was very helpful to me on that. He's written a book about it. And when also David Salter gave me that file, and when you go into it, you're going into, sorry, that was a different one, but you're going into, you've got to stop yourself, because these stories I just find so extraordinary.
So, I mean, the thing about the Opera House that is renowned throughout the world is that it's framed also by the harbour and the
Yes.
harbour bridge. So, was that involved in the conception of the Opera House and when they're building about what is it going to do to the harbour bridge? And was there anyone on the opposite side who was going, not it's a waste of money, not do we really need a hoity-toity Opera House, but why are you going to ruin the beautiful bridge?
I don't recall seeing stuff again at the bridge saying you're going to spoil the bridge. What I was fascinated to see was that the harbour bridge was a part of a perfect storm that gave Sydney the confidence to do the Opera House. Because when the bridge was first conceived in the early part of last century, and then I think finally finished open in 1932, all through the 20s there had been people saying this is ridiculous, this is a waste of money, and then the arches started to form and to meet up, and people were stunned and loved it. And so all those who had been critics of the Harbour Bridge were exposed as, exposed as not knowing what they're talking about. It's magnificent. And the Opera House was only 25 years later, and they remembered and said, well, you were against the bridge, and look at it now, it's magnificent. The Opera House will be that too. And the other thing I'd never appreciated, for architects, it was, for European architects, all the good spaces had gone 400 years ago. There's no space in Venice to build something modern and magnificent. So we were the new frontier, and it was also the flowering of multicultural Australia, that that Utsen's inspirations weren't purely from Denmark, not purely from what do you build in Sydney, but he got his influences from all around the world. And the tile came from, I think the tiles, even though manufactured in Sweden, the inspiration came from China and from mosques in the Middle East. He wanted something that would last forever and have that kind of sheen. And when the winner was announced, one of the runners-up was Harry Seidler. And Harry Seidler, in a moment of enormous generosity, took one look and said, instead of saying, it should have been me, somebody called the police, he said, the judges should be congratulated for their wisdom, and this is a stunning design. And he became Utsen's great defender. And yet, the Daily Mirror said the most wonderful line. The critics, people talked about what it looked like, and they said, this looks like the clippings of a giant albino dog. A pile of clippings from a giant albino dog. And yet my favourite quote of the lot comes from Louis Kahn, who was an American architect, and he said, the sun did not know how beautiful its light was until it shone on the Sydney Opera House. Isn't that brilliant?
Beautiful. In a moment we'll open up to questions, so if you have a question just think about it, and you'll be able to put up your hand and we'll take your questions, so noodle on that. But I'm interested in the functionality of this building. There has been criticism in the past. I think I can't remember who it was who said that Australia has the greatest opera house in the world, but the outside of it is in Sydney and the inside is in Melbourne. Because the inside of the Sydney Opera House is not regarded as being an acoustic triumph. It's all show. It doesn't actually do what it's supposed to do. It's not a convenient place to perform, for example.
And I think that's indisputable, that the people that have performed there, it's like the Albert Hall, it's like the Madison Square Garden. Wherever you played, I played the Sydney Opera House, Madison Square, Royal Albert Hall, but there's all those stories, and I've got them in the epilogue. I mean, I shut the book down mostly in 1973. The Queen opens it. Then you go to the epilogue of, well, what happened thereafter. And there has been criticism that very much along those lines. And then a few years ago, they dropped $560 million in trying to bring the acoustics up to speed. And they didn't drop it. I mean, they improved all the acoustics. People like me don't care. I just like looking at it. I mean, I mean, the truth of it is that in the course of doing this book, I thought, well, if I'm writing a book about the Sydney Opera House, I should go and see an opera, at the Opera House. And there was a particular opera on last year, and I'm told by opera aficionados that the particular opera I saw is basically opera for dummies, and I hated it. I just did. I don't get opera. I don't get ballet. I love plays. I love theatre. I love musicals. I love Hamilton. I love all those things. Stuff like that leaves me cold. But I'm a Sydney-sider, and I live up on the opposite shore 5 minutes drive up the hill. You've been to my house.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when you drive down Milson Road, 4 minutes away, you gaze across the waters of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. I've been living there since 1998. Every day that I'm there and I'm coming back from anywhere, I turn right and I go down Milson Road and I get to Cremorne Ferry Wharf and I look across to the Opera House, and I've been doing it for 25 years. I just love looking at it. What it sounds like inside, don't know, don't care.
And so you started out by talking about Joe Carl, right?
Yeah.
And most Sydneysiders now will only think of the name Carl for the Carl Expressway, the most egregious and obnoxious part of Australia's road network, covering over what could be an open playground between the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge. What became of old Joe, and what was his legacy?
He, late in I think it was October of 1959, and like, he was a smoker and he was probably not very healthy, but he basically had a heart attack. And he was in Parliament at the time. He goes down, they take him to St Vincent's, I think it was, or that hospital just next to Parliament. They call for his family, he calls for his offsider, and more or less with his dying breath, he says, look after the Opera House, make sure this goes through. And when he went, Utzon lost his greatest champion, because when Utzon wins and he flies into Sydney for the first time, here is the great Jorn Utzon, it's his design that's won the Sydney Opera House. He goes from the airport straight down to Bennelong Point, and the press are there. Joe Carl's not there, but he's looking around and he's just knocked out. It's everything he could possibly imagine. He can't believe that Sydney used to have a tram depot, right there, but of all places, and they were going to knock down the tram depot and put up a bus depot. That's really where we're going to put the bus depot, right there. Anyway, from there he goes to see Joe Carl, the Premier, and he goes and he shakes his hand and they're talking, and he says, Mr. Premier, I'm so just thrilled. I'm thrilled. There's only one thing that is not quite doing it for me. We're going to build an opera house here, the opera house here, and on the western foreshores of Bennelong Point, you've got working wharves and you've got fishing boats and Joe Carl said, just excuse me a moment, Mr. Whitson. Dorothy, just get me the Maritime Authority, please. Sorry, Mr. Oh yes, look, it's Premier Carl here. Look, the working wharves on the western foreshore, Bennelong Point, they'll need to be gone by Christmas. No, I don't know. They're not going to be there. Get the move. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Yes. Right. Bye. Sorry, Mr. Utzon, go on. And that was how he did it. I mean, that is Utzon's account of that conversation, that he said they've got to go. Joe Carl had the power to do it, and he did it. And, he should be more celebrated for that. And the Opera House itself, they should have at least a day a year where they say, this is free tickets, this is for everybody that's on the basic wage or whatever, but this is for you.
Mm. If you'd like to ask some questions, then feel free to pop your hand up and ask Peter. Don't be shy.
Yes.
Go for it.
I just wanted to ask. So, Woodson's design to win by the length of the track.
Yep.
What was second and third? Was there anything else that was worthy that you may have?
So let me just repeat the question.
I'll repeat it. He said, "I love your books.
Yeah, go for it.
Where can I buy your books?"
So the question was, what were the second and third runners-up to the entry for the design of the opera?
And it's very interesting because when you see, I think I've got, Matthew, did we get them in the photos? I let Matthew do the photos. But when you look at my publisher, when you look at the second and third designs, you go, no, because there is, again, Oscar Wilde, one of his great lines, he said, I've had a wonderful day's writing. This morning I put a comma in, this afternoon I took it out. And the idea being that on works of great creativity, there's a rightness to it. And so for me, with the Opera House, it is so wondrous, it is so magnificent, it's so right for that place that when you look at the second and third and fourth, they just look shocking. They just are these sharp lines, these massive tiers, and they don't look like anything of what the Opera House should be. But they weren't particular names. Harry Seidler was the only name that I recognised of famous, not that I'm known for recognising lots of architects' names, but I recognised Frank Lloyd Wright. And Frank Lloyd Wright, who had been Utzon's hero, when he saw the design, said, they're not going to let them build this monstrosity, are they? And you know, it was really confronting that Frank Lloyd Wright got it wrong.
I imagine what Utzon made of that. Probably took it to heart.
And Utzon's generosity of spirit was really something, because it's often built up that Sir Davis Hughes was the monster that, you know, that crushed the Utzon vision. And there's a certain truth in that. He was maybe unnecessarily abrasive or whatever. But Utzon himself, when Davis Hughes died, 20 years after the Opera House was opened, Utzon was in Denmark and he sent a message to Lady Hughes. And the message was, "I'm so sorry for your loss. I have my deepest condolences. That opera house, my opera house, would never have been finished if not for Davis Hughes." And I thought, gee, that's an amazing generosity.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Any other questions?
Come on, I'm not going until I hear three questions.
I'll take this guy over here.
Is there any stories that you could find, you want to find out more about, but you just couldn't find enough?
Are there any stories that you wanted to find out about, but you just couldn't find out enough about?
Yeah, that's interesting. No, probably not, because I get sort of so obsessed that when I sort of sniff a story, I do unleash a lot of resources to get to the bottom of it. So at the moment, I'm doing a book on Long Tan, and there is a stunning story of the choppers that came in. This guy called Frank Riley, who, when we had 108 diggers surrounded by 3,000 VC, very brave VC too, and our guys are just about to go under when this chopper guy, Frank Riley, says, "I'll take my chopper in and we'll drop it over." And I can't spend enough hours, enough days, enough weeks. I don't care. It doesn't make sense to go into it that deeply, but I love it because I just want it. And so with the Opera House, the greatest challenge was the engineering angles, because the unsung heroes are the engineers that made that stand up. And yet, to get my head around, my brother is a civil engineer. He's either a civil engineer or a civic engineer. I get them mixed up, but he's very clever. And he was able to explain a lot of the concepts to me. And something, just as a matter of interest, in terms of the shape of the shells of that opera house, it was Utzon himself who came up with a solution. It's known as the spherical solution. Each one of those shells would fit. They're perfectly spherical and would fit in a sphere that was 75.1 metres radius. And so, yeah, I think I got to the bottom of most of it, but of all the books I've handed over back to the publisher, that's the one that I didn't want to let it go, because I just kept gnawing at it, and I love the story. Thank you.
And just on the issue of the spheres, yeah, I'll come to you in just a second. On the issue of the spheres, so there are so many different claims about the sail. It's sort of apocryphal that it was inspired by sails. Some people say that it's inspired by that he was cutting an orange and he saw an orange.
Yes, the mandarin. I love that story.
And so
that
on.
story doesn't quite
Did you
stack
get
up.
To the bottom of any of that? Yes.
But that story doesn't stand up quite as well as I would.
Can I believe it anyway?
Yeah, well, you can tell, you can keep, it's all in there, page 362. But it was Utzon that he wasn't, the Robert Hughes line, "A magnificent doodle," doesn't do justice to the genius, because of also the Utzon's ability to come up with that solution, which had defied previous engineers. But the engineers, Ove Arup was a Danish-English engineer, and he saw the design and contacted Utzon and said, "Oh, I'd like to help you build it." And he did. And they were like father and son. They were so close. And yet with the stresses and strains of building their relationship ruptured. And when Utzon left in February of '66, Arup wrote to him, "What are you doing? You've got to come back." And they never spoke again. And until 1978, they were both being honoured by the English Architectural Royal Architectural Society, and they were on the stage at the same time. They shook hands and turned their back. And then they had a mutual friend who was with Arup in Copenhagen, and he called up Utzon and said, "I've got Ove Arup here, can we come over?" And Utzon said, "No, well, you can't."
Wow. Yeah, go for it.
The building, as you say, is kind of timeless and transcendent, and I guess in your research you would have spoken to a lot of architects and a lot of people who are
Yes.
where it is. Where do they see, or where do you see Sydney in the sort of the spectrum of architecture, on the chronology of architecture? Is it positive period? Is it a sort of flourish? What's the feeling at the moment?
Sorry, are you talking about the moment being now, 2022?
Now,
Oh, you
Yeah,
mean
so the-
Sydney architecture now?
Yeah, the question is,
so I guess from when the Opera House was built, as it's kind of hit some timelessness just by being there, what's happened with the rest of architecture in Sydney?
That's a
so
really
the question
interesting...
is, what has happened to the rest of architecture in Sydney over the duration of the Opera House's life?
Again, it's a bit above my pay grade to make commentary on architecture in Sydney. I love architecture. I mean, I'm an aficionado of it without deep knowledge of it. So, but I do say, you know, when we come off the bridge, that when you come off the bridge and you go down York Street and you see the old Scots Church, anybody see that? Is that the biggest monstrosity in Sydney? What they've done to that? It's like the only clever thing Prince Charles ever said was an extension on the National Gallery, and he said it's a monstrous carbuncle on the face of a well-loved friend. And so I look at stuff like that and go, what were they thinking? But what the Opera House did, this architect in Stockholm whose building changed Sweden, and there's a connection between that, using new materials in a new way, between the establishment of IKEA, which went on to rule the world. And that's what Utzon wanted for the Opera House. And I quote again Oscar Wilde, who at Oxford, at a college in Oxford in the late 1870s, I think it was, he said, "Every day I find it harder and harder to live up to my blue china." And I love that line. You know, that somebody is got, if I'm going to own blue china that beautiful, I'd better live an aesthetic life myself. And the Opera House is, if we're going to have a building that magnificent, Time magazine did a thing 20 years ago, the 100 most influential buildings in the world, the Opera House was the one they put on the front cover. And if we're going to have a building that magnificent, then our theatre, our ballet, our opera, our drama has got to rise to that level. And it did, it lifted it. And it also, I think, again, there'll be architects here who'll know so much more than me about it, but broadly, when Utzon flew in, and this is another line, when he flew into Sydney and he looks at Sydney, what he sees is a magnificent harbour. But what he can't understand is why, with such a harbour, do they build so many red boxes? On the, you know, and that's the way he saw it. Red boxes. And when I saw that line, and everywhere I look now, I see red boxes. But after the Opera House, I think it's fair to say that our architecture became far more interesting because he showed the possibilities of, you don't just do shoebox on shoebox on shoe. You know the Askin skyline? I live not far from Spit Junction, and they talk about the Askin skyline, that as you're heading down to the Spit Bridge, you look at those buildings on the left and the right. What were they thinking? What were they thinking?
Leave that as the rhetorical question to hang in the air. Yeah, over there.
Do we know if the original plans have been followed to make the concert halls for theatre, the opera theatre, the new theatre? The acoustics would have been better?
The question is, do we know if the original plans had been followed to make the concert hall smaller? Was it whether the acoustics would have been better?
Yes. And the answer about that, it was never possible. Peter Hall, when he looked at the plans, there were 118, 119 plans, and then when he looked at what Utzon had planned, he said, this is illegal. On the planning specifications of the distance you need to have between your knees and your buttocks and the chair in front, and fire exits and the rest and all that, he just said, well, you can't, goes totally contravenes everything that proper planning's about. And so the first thing that Peter Hall did was he flew around the world to modern theatres to try to work out, but it was a thing of staggering complexity.
Any other questions? Yeah,
You-
follow up.
Just a fun one. Was the lack of northerly facing windows any cause for Prime Minister's cold hearts?
Was the lack of northerly facing windows the cause of Prime Minister's cold hearts?
At St Paul's College, though, I tell you, do you remember we had Andrew Refshaugi? Andrew Refshaugi was the Deputy Premier of New South Wales for quite a while. About 15, 16 years ago, and he was a blue blood, I think he was from Shaw or Kings or something like that, and he had a total Capel Liberal background. He was at Paul's College when Billy McMahon came, and he became this firebrand, hard left Labor man. And what turned him, he said to me once, was he was there when Billy McMahon came and talked about Vietnam, and he was absolutely outraged, and he was a man from Paul's College. And I tell you, at Paul's College, when I was at university, was the last bastion of blue blood conservatism in the country. And I always thought that, after the revolution, that's where we'll find the last of them. But I spoke there not long ago, and there was a young Indigenous man who gave a welcome to country that really was just fantastic. And I thought, if welcome to country has made it to the insides of St Paul's College, that's, there can't be anywhere left that's not, apart from the one headquarters of One Nation.
Last question, Peter. Just on your process, really, because you've been so prolific and you've done so many books, and you just mentioned that you're working on one on long tan now. As you walk through life, are you just constantly sort of seeing things and hearing anecdotes that make you think there might be a book in that? And do you have a notebook that's 70 pages long with little jottings about potential future book ideas? How do you whittle it down and go, this is the one?
People are constantly writing to me and saying, do you know about this, do you know about that? And the best story, the two best stories in the history of the world, there'll never be a better story than the shipwreck of the Batavia. Anybody? Yeah, I mean, do you agree? There'll never be. That's just it. And I'd never heard about it until my publisher in '98 said to me, well, what about the Batavia? And what's the Batavia? And I went back to the Herald. One of the great things about the Herald, of the many things, that we had a library, and I said, can I have the Batavia file, please? And it was an inch thick. And 2 days disappeared, and I just obsessed by that story. And the other one is the Catalpa rescue. Okay, anybody read the Catalpa rescue? The Catalpa rescue is the second best story in the history of the world. And so that, again, that would have been a reader wrote to me about it. So I'm constantly getting, can I tell the Catalpa rescue story very quickly?
Go for it.
Just quickly, okay? I think, is it a Hachette book, Catalpa, or not? It's a Hachette book, so it's okay. So, I'll make this really quick. This is the second best story in the history of the world. His name was John Devoy. So there, for 700 years, the island is trying to throw the Brits out. Not unreasonably. This is Ireland, get out the Brits. Anyway, the plan is, how are we going to get rid of the Brits? Well, we're going to have peasants with pikes in the moonlight, we'll stab a few Brits, and the Irish peasants will rise and we'll throw the lot of them out. For 700 years, the Brits called in the cannon and blew them away. Until in the mid-1850s, after the troubles of 1848, the famine, John Devoy, John Devoy, whose brother had died in his arms of starvation, devotes himself to the idea, we're going to establish the Fenians. We've got 5,000 English officers, British officers, and we've got 50,000 Irish soldiers. So what we've got to do is, in every company, in every battalion, we've got to have our men, so that next time the revolution, when instead of peasants with pikes in the moonlight, we'll have our own people on the inside. They'll blow up the bridges, they'll nobble the cannons, they'll slit the throats of the English, and we'll have Ireland for a good plan. The plan is discovered, and John Devoy, because he was not a soldier, is placed in manacles and sent up to an English prison ship to go to England. Meantime, 65 of the Fenian soldiers who had committed treason because they'd promised to be loyal to Her Madge are sent to Fremantle prison. Okay, so the most remote part of the British Empire, they go to Fremantle prison, and John Devoy, through various means and amnesties and so forth, is let out. You still with me? You want me to speed it up?
No.
He's let out of English prison. You can't go back to Ireland. You've got to go to New York. You've got to go to America. So John Devoy goes to America and establishes a new life. The Fenians they get off the ship, and there is this Fremantle prison on the hill and the blinding light. And for the next 10 years, they're on road camps and they're starving and they're dying. And by 1874, there's only 6 of them left. And John Devoy is, by this time, a successful publisher in America. And he comes back from a drunken lunch, and there is this scungy envelope on the table, and on his desk, and he opens it up and he starts to read, and the letter says, we're dying. We are in the living tomb in Fremantle prison. There's only 6 of us left. You've got us here. You've got to get us out. John Devoy goes up and down the eastern seaboard of America. He talks to 7,000 Irish Americans. He says, give me money. What do you want? Give me money. He got $30,000. He goes up to Boston. He buys a whaler called the Catalpa. He hires an American sailing captain, a whaler, let's call him Captain Swashbuckle, with 18 swashbucklettes, and they sail for Fremantle. He sends two emissaries across the Pacific Ocean to get there ahead of them, to go across Australia. They get to Fremantle prison disguised as Irish American investors and says, we're going to need some labour. Well, maybe we get it from the prison. Yes, we'd like to see the prison. These are our famous Fenians. They say, help is at hand, we're on the way, we're going to get you out. And on the 17th of August, the 6 of them have got the plans, and the plans are, you've got to get to the Gumtree by the Piggery. We'll have 2 buggies waiting there for you. Here are your forged papers. Boss, I've got to get some kerosene. Boss, I've got to get some more paint. Boss, I've got to move furniture. So they go, and then they're going, and then they're challenged. Here are the papers. We're about to go to the governor's house. The 6 of them get to under the Gumtree by the Piggery. They jump in the buggies. There is the 2 men waiting for them. They race to Rockingham Beach. There is Captain Swashbuckle with the lifeboats. They jump in the lifeboats and they pull out to sea just as the armed troopers, Kelly, Davison, Fitzroy, burst onto the beach with the Indigenous black trackers, and they're lining up and they're shooting, but they get out beyond the breakers. Every brilliant story needs a dark and stormy night. What do you think they had that night? I'm nearly there. Dark and stormy night, they just survive. The following day, they're out there, they're looking for the Catalpa, and they can, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they see the sails of the Catalpa. They race towards and pull towards the Catalpa, the 6 prisoners with Captain Swashbuckle, with the 6 sailors, and then they see the steam coming from the Coast Guard, coming out from Fremantle. There's a race between the 2. The prisoners get on the Catalpa. The Coast Guard pulls up alongside, says, pull over, driver. At this point, Captain Swashbuckle gets the American flag, pulls it up, stars and stripes, and says, we are a ship sailing under the flag of the United States of America. If you fire upon this ship in international waters, a state of war will exist between the United States of America and the colony of Western Australia. Captain Coast Guard says, wait right there, I'm going back for further instructions. We'll wait right here. He goes back, they disappear. When they get to New York 6 months later, there is 300,000 Irish Americans greeting them on the streets of Fifth Avenue. They all go on to live happily ever after. John Devoy, however, in 1922, Ireland is now free. He's devoted his life to it. There's an 86-year-old man that is on his 16 miles off the coast. He's on the US Herbert Hoover, and he's having his breakfast, and he's a bit maudlin because he's devoted his life, but he's never loved a woman like he loved sweet Eliza Doolittle. And sweet Eliza, when he'd gone up the prison ship, he'd written to her and said, I hope I come back, but if I ever get out and you're still available, I want to marry you. Anyway, he'd heard that sweet Eliza had married another, and then he heard she died in 1904, and he's having his porridge, and the cable boy comes, and the cable says, Dear John Devoy, this is the President of Ireland. We know who you are. We know what you've done. When you land on our shores, you will be a guest of the People's Republic of Ireland. He writes back and says, thank you, I'm just here to see my niece. I don't want any trouble. They don't care. When he lands on Ireland, he hadn't been there for 65 years, and the last time he left, he was in manacles, and now he comes down. As he comes down the gangplank, there are 60 Irish soldiers, 30 on each side. Company, present, arms, salute. And they salute him, and he goes and he gets in a carriage and he goes to the station, he goes up to Dublin, and he goes uphill down Dale for 6 days, being feted and greeted. Here is the great John Devoy, and on the 7th day, he's having his porridge, as you do, and knock on the door. It's the cable boy. His niece opens and says, there's a letter for you. And he looks at it and he recognises the handwriting. It's from sweet Eliza. She's alive. And he opens it up, and it says, Dear John, it has been the mission of my life to see you again. He hadn't married another. She'd waited for him for 17 fucking years, finally marrying another. It wasn't her that had died in 1904, it was her sister, and she lives 3 miles away. And he goes to her door, and with his withered 86-year-old arm, knocks on the door, and it takes 90 seconds for her withered 86-year-old legs to come down the hallway. She opens the door, and they fall into each other's arms for the first time in 65 years. And if you think that's a good story, wait till you read the Sydney Opera House.
Peter FitzSimons, ladies and gentlemen. Peter will be signing books over there.
Thank you.
Good on you.
And can I just say, with great thanks to Josh Szeps, who filled in at the last minute.